Everyone talks about the Caitlin Clark effect, like it's an unstoppable force that lifted the WNBA to new heights, as if Clark's arrival instantaneously solved every problem the league ever had. Social media was flooded with record numbers, viral moments, and national attention that the league hadn't seen in years. But now a whisper is growing louder in sports circles. Is the buzz disappearing? Are the ratings that surged at the beginning actually fading? To discover the real story, you need to look past the sensationalist hot takes and examine how audiences are reacting, how broadcasters are reporting numbers, and what sustained viewership really looks like once the novelty wears off. Understanding the Caitlin Clark effect? When Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, the immediate focus wasn't just her ability to score or her college legend status. What truly captured attention was the scale of mainstream engagement that followed her first games. National TV networks touted viewership, tickets sold out faster than expected, and people who never watched women's basketball before suddenly found themselves tuning in. It was not merely about a single player, it was about how she seemed to pull in a broader audience. Casual sports fans, media outlets hungry for breaking narratives, and listeners to national podcasts who suddenly found themselves talking about the WNBA every week. That chain of events became known as the Caitlin Clark effect, a term used to describe increased visibility, bigger audience numbers, and a sense of momentum that felt transformational for the league. But now that the season has progressed, a more nuanced conversation is emerging, one that asks whether the initial spike in attention has turned into long-term, consistent viewership, or if it was merely a temporary burst of curiosity. The ratings roller coaster, early surges and sudden dips. At the beginning of the WNBA season, broadcasters openly shared several viewership milestones that dwarfed past returns for similar matchups. Clark's debut was positioned as a marquee event, and the ratings reflected greater interest than what the league had been accustomed to in previous years. But as the season progressed, some games that lacked Clark on the court saw noticeable declines in viewership compared to those opening weeks. This led analysts and commentators to speculate that the spike in ratings was tied more to her presence than to the overall growth of women's basketball. Critics pointed out that once the novelty wore off, the numbers began adjusting downward. Not just slightly, but in ways that alarmed media executives who had hoped for consistent upward trends. The sheer volume of early attention made the later declines feel more dramatic, even though fluctuations in ratings are common across all sports leagues. To understand whether this decline represents a real crisis or just statistical normalization, you have to examine deeper patterns over time, not just the headlines from one or two televised games. Audience engagement beyond TV numbers. Basketball watchers no longer gather around television sets alone. Streaming platforms, digital highlights, social media clips, and video on demand have become core components of how people consume sports. When the WNBA and broadcasters report ratings, they often focus on traditional Nielsen numbers, the linear TV audience tuning in at a specific time on a specific channel. But what about the millions who watch highlights later on YouTube, who share clips on TikTok, or who follow games via Instagram Reels? Those engagement metrics are harder to quantify in standard ratings reports, yet they are increasingly how a younger audience consumes sports content. If you were to measure the Caitlin Clark effect by the volume of digital interactions, user-generated content, and viral moments shared across platforms, the narrative shifts dramatically. Instead of crashing, the effect appears to be redistributing from conventional TV ratings into a more fragmented but equally powerful media landscape. In other words, the influence Clark has had may not be fully captured by traditional audience measurement tools, indicating that the assumption of a ratings collapse is based on outdated metrics. The role of veteran viewers versus new fans. Another layer of the story is the composition of the audience. Early viewership spikes were driven not only by longtime women's basketball fans, but also by casual viewers curious about Caitlin Clark. These viewers tuned in to witness a historical moment, generating numbers that suddenly looked spectacular by comparison to past seasons. But casual viewers are also more likely to tune out when major media narratives shift or when their preferred personalities are not on screen. That doesn't mean they lost interest in the sport. It simply means they wandered back into other entertainment options that compete for their attention. Loyal fans of the WNBA, those who have followed the league through different eras and champions, remain engaged consistently. These viewers may not make headline-grabbing ratings announcements, but their sustained viewership forms the backbone of the league's audience. Understanding this distinction helps clarify the difference between temporary spikes and long-term fan engagement. The reality for the WNBA, one of the unfair expectations created by the early Caitlin Clark effect narrative, was that the league would suddenly become the most popular sport in the country overnight. That was never a realistic outcome. Sustainable growth in any sport requires patience, consistent storytelling, community building, and opportunities for fans to deepen their connection. The WNBA has made significant strides in all of those areas, and Clark's presence accelerated national attention in ways that most players never experience. Even if ratings softened after the initial surge, the long-term effect remains positive because the league attracted eyes and ears that it had never reached before. Some of those viewers will remain, some will come back later, and others will share the experience with their friends. The result is a broader footprint than before, even if the initial shockwave of viewership has leveled off. Why the crash narrative is oversold. When news outlets declare that ratings are collapsing or that the Caitlin Clark effect has fizzled, they are often repeating a sensationalized interpretation rather than a data-driven conclusion. Ratings can be complex to interpret, and isolating one player's influence on the entire league is nearly impossible. Moreover, the focus on short-term declines ignores the evidence of long-term expansion of the fan base, increased sponsorship interest, and broader cultural visibility for women's basketball. The narrative that the effect is crashing primarily exists because rapid growth invites immediate comparison to previous records. When audiences don't continue breaking every record every week, commentators treat that as bad news, even though normalizing after an exceptional burst of attention is entirely expected. What matters more is whether the league maintains a larger and more engaged audience than it had before Clark's debut. And by that measure, the effect appears to be real and ongoing, not collapsing. The truth about ratings and what comes next. The truth is that the Caitlin Clark effect was always going to be multidimensional. It wasn't just about viewership numbers for one or two games. It was about a broader cultural moment that elevated awareness of the league, brought new fans into the conversation, and expanded the reach of women's basketball across platforms. Ratings are one piece of the puzzle, but they are not the whole story. If the WNBA can continue building on this momentum by cultivating fan communities, creating accessible content, and celebrating the achievements of its players beyond single narratives, the league will continue to grow. Clark is a part of that ongoing story, but she is not the entire chapter. The future of the league depends on how all players, teams, and stakeholders work together to retain interest, build loyalty, and make every game matter to audiences old and new. The effect isn't crashing, it's evolving. The idea that the Caitlin Clark effect is crashing simplifies something that is far more complex and far more exciting. Instead of viewing ratings changes as signs of failure, it's more accurate to see them as part of a transition in how audiences watch, engage, and stay connected with sports. The WNBA is not collapsing in popularity. It is evolving with the times and expanding into new territories of media consumption that traditional ratings alone cannot capture. Clark's presence accelerated that process and brought it into the spotlight faster than many expected. The real truth is that the league today has more fans, more visibility, and more cultural relevance than it did before, and that is something worth celebrating. The long-term impact of this moment may only be fully visible years down the road, but there is nothing in the data or the trends that suggests the effect is crashing. Rather, it is maturing, broadening, and deepening, far beyond the short-term headlines. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, and share your perspective on social media or in the comments of your next video.